The clock had just struck midnight when the convoy of black SUVs pulled up to Walter Reed Military Hospital. The night staff barely registered the arrival at first, assuming it was another routine government visit. But when President Donald Trump stepped out, flanked by Secret Service agents rather than the usual entourage of advisors and media personnel, the atmosphere in the hospital shifted perceptibly. There were no cameras, no prepared speeches, no press pool, recalls Dr. James Reynolds, the hospital's chief of emergency medicine who was on duty that night. Just the president, asking to be taken to our soldiers. The unusual timing and lack of media presence immediately set this visit apart from typical presidential appearances. According to multiple staff members present that night, Trump arrived with minimal security detail and explicitly requested that no photographs be taken. He told us, "This isn't for the cameras," says Nancy Chen, the head nurse on duty. "It was the first indication that we were about to witness something extraordinary." Before we continue this untold incident, let us know where you're watching from. Subscribe now. Tomorrow, we reveal another powerful story that never made the headlines. Hospital security logs confirmed the arrival time as 12:17 a.m., with only 4 Secret Service agents accompanying the president, a stark contrast to the usual presidential entourage. The visit had not been pre-announced even to the hospital's senior administration, breaking with long-standing protocols for presidential movements. As Trump moved through the quiet hallways, the night shift staff observed a departure from the choreographed nature of typical presidential visits. Emily Thompson, a veteran nurse of 15 years, remembers the moment vividly. He wasn't reading from a briefing paper or following a predetermined route. He stopped at rooms randomly, drawn by the stories he glimpsed through open doors. The first extended interaction occurred in Ward 4B, where Private James Carter, a double amputee, lay awake, struggling with what his medical records described as severe depression following his combat injuries. Carter, who had previously rejected most visitors, found himself in an unexpected conversation with the President of the United States. "I actually tried to wave him off," Carter recalls, a slight smile now playing on his face. "I said something like, 'You don't have to pretend you care.' But instead of moving on, he pulled up a chair. That's when I realized this wasn't a normal presidential visit." According to Carter and the attending nurse, Trump spent over 40 minutes in that initial conversation, listening to the young soldier's story of loss, abandonment, and the struggle to find purpose after his injuries. The interaction would later prove to be the catalyst for significant changes in veteran care protocols. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows in the intensive care unit as Trump approached room 207. Outside, a small boy clutched a worn teddy bear, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but unable to sleep. Michael Rodriguez, just 7 years old, had been keeping vigil outside his father's room for 3 days straight. Inside lay Captain David Rodriguez, a decorated combat veteran who hadn't shown signs of consciousness since his medical evacuation from Afghanistan 2 weeks earlier. The medical charts told a story of declining hope, multiple surgeries, failed responses to treatment, and a prognosis that grew darker with each passing day. "We were preparing for the worst," admits Dr. Sarah Chen, the ICU specialist who had been overseeing Rodriguez's care. "The brain activity readings were minimal. We were running out of options." What happened next would become the subject of intense discussion among the medical staff, though few would speak about it on record. Trump entered the room alone, asking the Secret Service to wait outside. For exactly 17 minutes, as logged by the ICU monitoring system, he remained inside. When nurse practitioner Jessica Martinez entered to perform routine checks, she found an unexpected scene. The president was sitting there, talking to Captain Rodriguez as if he were conscious, she recalls. He was speaking about the captain's son, about duty, about fighting to come back. And then, Martinez pauses, still struggling to explain what she witnessed. The monitors started showing changes we hadn't seen in 2 weeks. Before Trump could process what was happening in the ICU, an urgent message arrived from the hospital's psychiatric ward. Sergeant William Reynolds, a veteran of 3 combat tours and recipient of the Silver Star, had refused his evening medications again. But this wasn't just another case of a soldier struggling with PTSD. Reynolds carried a burden few knew about, one that would soon force the president to confront the true cost of war. The sergeant's room was at the end of a quiet corridor away from the main ward. As Trump approached, the night staff exchanged worried glances. Reynolds hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, not since receiving news that would shatter any parent's world. But something about this night felt different. Through the window, they could see Reynolds sitting in his wheelchair, staring at a photograph illuminated only by moonlight. What Trump didn't know as he reached for the door handle was that this encounter would lead to one of the most significant changes in military family support policy in decades. But first, he would have to break through walls built by years of grief, anger, and a system that had failed one too many heroes. The silence in Sergeant Reynolds's room was broken only by the soft rustle of paper as he gripped the worn photograph. "That's my son," he said without looking up, his voice rough from weeks of disuse. "Lieutenant Jason Reynolds. They said he died a hero." Trump stood quietly, studying the image of a young man in dress uniform, his smile bright with promise. What Reynolds didn't know was that earlier that day, Trump had received a classified briefing about the mission that claimed his son's life, information that had never reached the grieving father. "They forgot him," Reynolds continued, bitterness etching his words. "One day of headlines, then nothing." His hands trembled as he spoke, the photograph shaking slightly. "Do you know what it's like, Mr. President, to watch the world forget your child?" But Trump wasn't looking at Reynolds anymore. His attention had fixed on something else, a metal case tucked in the corner, collecting dust. What he saw there would set in motion a chain of events that would reach far beyond this quiet hospital room. As the night deepened, word spread through the hospital's corridors. Nurses whispered about changes in vital signs. Doctors hurried between rooms, and somewhere in the ICU, young Michael Rodriguez still clutched his teddy bear, unaware that his father's monitors had begun showing unprecedented activity. Dr. Chen rushed past Trump's security detail, clutching a set of readings that defied medical explanation. "Mr. President," she called out, her voice urgent. But before she could reach him, Trump emerged from Reynolds' room with an expression that stopped her in her tracks. "Get me everything," he commanded his aide. "Every forgotten hero, every overlooked sacrifice, names, stories, families." He pulled out his personal phone, not the official presidential device, and began making calls that would stretch into the early hours of the morning. What happened next would be recorded in multiple staff logs, though few could agree on the exact sequence of events. Dr. Reynolds remembers the president working from a makeshift desk in the hospital's administrative office, surrounded by medical files and military records. Emily Thompson recalls him in the ICU, speaking in hushed tones to unconscious soldiers. Security footage would later show him walking the halls until dawn, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, taking notes in a small black book. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the hospital windows, Captain Rodriguez opened his eyes for the first time in 2 weeks. In the psychiatric ward, Sergeant Reynolds requested his morning medications, something he hadn't done in months. And in Ward 4B, Private James Carter asked to speak with a physical therapist. But it was what happened in Washington in the hours that followed that would truly demonstrate the impact of that night. Trump's chief of staff would later describe receiving over 30 phone calls between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m., each with specific directives about veteran care reform. The president was different after that night, recalls a senior White House official who requested anonymity. He had names, stories, details that weren't in any briefing, and he was determined to do something about each one. The next morning, White House staff arrived to find the Oval Office already occupied. Trump sat at his desk, the morning light casting long shadows across stacks of military files and hospital records. His appearance, still in the previous day's suit, tie undone, told the story of a sleepless night. "Cancel my schedule," he ordered without looking up from the documents. All of it. What followed was unprecedented in recent presidential history. For the next 72 hours, the President of the United States effectively disappeared from public view. No tweets, no appearances, no public statements. But behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. It was like watching a tsunami build, recalls Jennifer Martinez, then Deputy Chief of Staff. You couldn't see it yet, but you could feel the pressure building in every meeting, every phone call, every hurried conversation in the hallways. White House logs from those 3 days reveal a flurry of activity that would reshape veteran care in America. Between classified briefings and emergency meetings, Trump made 47 personal phone calls to military families. Each call lasted an average of 23 minutes, far longer than typical presidential condolence calls. But it was what happened in meeting room 233 of the White House's West Wing that would truly change everything. For 6 hours straight, Trump met with a hastily assembled team of military healthcare experts, veteran advocates, and family support specialists. The only break came when an aide delivered an urgent update from Walter Reed. Captain Rodriguez had spoken his first words in 2 weeks. The president stopped mid-sentence, remembers Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the healthcare experts present. He wrote something in that small black notebook he'd been carrying since the hospital visit, then looked up at us with an expression I'll never forget. "We're not leaving this room until we fix this," he said. As these changes were taking shape in Washington, Emily Thompson, the night nurse from Walter Reed, sat down to write a letter. She didn't expect it to reach the president, much less spark a national movement. "I just wanted him to know what happened after he left," she explains, smoothing the copy of the letter she keeps framed in her office. How Private Carter asked for his physical therapy schedule, how Sergeant Reynolds started joining the other veterans for meals, how Captain Rodriguez's son finally got to hug his father. The 5-page handwritten letter made its way through White House security and landed on Trump's desk 3 days after his hospital visit. What happened next would transform the letter into a blueprint for change. Within weeks, a series of executive orders began quietly reshaping military health care. The changes weren't announced with fanfare or political speech-making. They simply appeared, one after another, each addressing specific issues Trump had witnessed that night. The Silent Heroes Initiative, as it became known within the Pentagon, established unprecedented support for military families. Educational scholarships for children of fallen soldiers, comprehensive mental health programs for veterans and their families, enhanced rehabilitation services. Each program seemed precisely targeted, as if designed around specific individuals, because they were. "Look at the Rodriguez Protocol," says Dr. Chen, now head of neurological recovery at Walter Reed. "The president took what we learned from Captain Rodriguez's miraculous recovery and turned it into a nationwide standard of care. Every detail, down to allowing family members extended ICU visits, came from that night." The statistics landed on the president's desk exactly 1 year after his midnight visit. They told a story that even the most optimistic observers hadn't expected. Veteran suicide rates had dropped 23% across facilities implementing the new protocols. The Rodriguez Protocol, now standard in military hospitals nationwide, had improved recovery rates for severe trauma patients by 31%. Over 500 children of fallen soldiers had received full educational scholarships. But behind these numbers lay even more compelling stories. "Numbers don't tell you about Michael Rodriguez acing his math test," says Emily Thompson, showing a crayon drawing the young boy sent her, or about James Carter coaching Paralympic athletes. These are the real measures of success. In a sunlit room at Walter Reed, an unusual gathering takes place every Thursday morning. James Carter, now leading peer support sessions from his wheelchair, sits beside Captain Rodriguez, who walks with a cane but speaks with unwavering strength. Sergeant Reynolds, no longer isolated in his grief, shares stories about his son with new arrivals struggling with their own losses. They call themselves the Midnight Brotherhood, a reference to that fateful night that brought them together. What started as 3 veterans supporting each other has grown into a nationwide network of over 2,000 members. "We were all fighting our battles alone until that night," Carter explains, watching new members arrive for today's session. Now, no one fights alone. The story might have ended there: a successful policy change, lives transformed, a system improved. But on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after his midnight visit, Trump returned to Walter Reed. No media, no announcements, just a man keeping a promise. This time, he found a different hospital. The halls buzzed with energy, rehabilitation rooms filled with determined veterans working toward recovery. Support group meetings overflowed with participants. In the children's waiting area, a wall displayed dozens of college acceptance letters, the first wave of scholarship recipients from the Silent Heroes Initiative. When he reached room 207, now occupied by a new patient, he paused. A plaque beside the door read, "The Reynolds Recovery Suite," in honor of Lieutenant Jason Reynolds and all who gave their last full measure of devotion. As this story comes to light, one detail remained unexplained: the small black notebook Trump carried that night. When asked about its contents, he finally shared its purpose. Every name, every story, every promise made that night was recorded in those pages. The last entry, dated 1 year after the visit, simply reads, "Promises kept." But perhaps the most telling testament comes from an unexpected source. Michael Rodriguez, now 8 years old and thriving in school thanks to the Silent Heroes Scholarship, recently wrote a class essay titled, "My Hero." It wasn't about the president, or even his recovered father. It was about hope. "Sometimes heroes don't wear capes," he wrote. "Sometimes they just show up when you need them most, even if it's midnight, and remind you that you're not forgotten." As dawn breaks over Walter Reed today, the impact of that midnight visit continues to ripple outward. The Midnight Brotherhood has chapters in 30 states. The Rodriguez Protocol has been adopted by military hospitals in 3 countries. The Silent Heroes Initiative has become a model for veteran support programs worldwide. Emily Thompson still works the night shift, though she's now the director of Veteran Services. "Every night at midnight, I remember," she says, touching the framed letter on her wall, "that's when I learned that sometimes the biggest changes start in the quietest moments." In the end, this isn't just a story about one night or one visit. It's about what happens when someone takes the time to listen, to care, and to act. It's about promises made in darkness and kept in light. It's about remembering that behind every statistic, every policy change, and every program, there's a person waiting to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. Did this untold story of a midnight hospital visit reveal a different side of presidential leadership? Was this genuine compassion, or should moments like these have been shared with the public sooner? Share your perspective. What would you have done in that moment? Drop your thoughts below. If you believe in honoring our veterans, in sharing the untold stories of those who serve, and in recognizing quiet acts of leadership, hit subscribe and join our community. Every day, we bring you the powerful stories that others miss. Because some of the most important moments happen when the cameras aren't rolling. This is Alex, signing off.